But as for the physical and moral concourse of God to evil, physical as well as moral, it seems incompatible with justice taken in the second sense, as a divine attribute. Everything depends on God, so that every creature and every action take its being and its reality from his omnipotence and keep on existing thanks to it. God contributes to sins by his will and by his power, insofar as nothing would happen unless he made it happen and wanted or permitted it. The problem raised here is the problem of predestination and of human liberty. What is then the legitimacy of the punishment of the sinner if the sin is in fact and ultimately imputable to God? So, as we can see, the way Leibniz tackles the problem of evil from the point of view of the law, and more precisely from the point of view of the divine justice taken in these two senses, explain his choice of writing a Theodicy. The solution of the problems we have mentioned presupposes putting forward the doctrine of the justice of God that proves his innocence and his holiness, and explains the rules of his conduct towards his creatures in the world. Does it mean Theodicy has only a theological significance? Paul Ricoeur seems to think so when he defines Theodicy as the attempt to conciliate three positions apparently incompatible. God is almighty, his goodness is infinite, evil does exist. In fact, the Leibniz point of view is not exclusively theological, but also anthropological. We have only to read the complete title he gave to his book. He says on Theodicy, on the goodness of God, the freedom of man, and the origin of evil. In order to solve the problem of evil in all its aspects, we need to consider the nature of God, his attributes, as well as the nature of man, his liberty. Thus, Leibniz deals with the problem of evil at two different but complementary levels. First, the theological part focuses on God and his perfections, examines the relation between his infinite understanding and his absolutely good will, and concludes that he cannot be the author of sin that he only permits for good reason. See in particular section 3 to 33 or the first part of the essays. And by this, the idea of providence is saved. Second part, the anthropological part focuses on man, his natural imperfection, his corruption since Adam, and the consequences of his corruption on his liberty. It shows his real responsibility in the sins he commits and the moral principles according to which he must act. See in particular section 34 to section 106. The difficulties here concerning predestination will be solved in that part. These two parts make up the heart of the doctrine of Theodicy. The question is now to know how we can characterize the arguments which are developed in it. Are the essays of Theodicy something like an apologetic discourse, a plea for the divine justice, a detailed response to Bale's objections, or a treatise on evil? The text may appear disconcerting, as we find in it different types of reasons and proofs. Sometimes Leibniz considers some a priori reasons, in particular when he speaks about the nature of God. But in other passages, he uses probable arguments, even simple conjectures or reason drawn from experience. For example, when he discusses the question whether or not the number of goods exceed the number of evils in the whole universe. The value of a conjecture, a presumption, or probability, which has also degrees, is obviously not the same as the value of an apologetic demonstration. Philosophically, what is drawn from the a priori has a higher significance than what comes from an a posteriori considerations. According to some readers and commentators, this use of various sorts of proofs, which are not always and strictly demonstrative, reveals a lack of rigor. It shows that the essays are not really a scientific book, and that Leibniz was more concerned to persuade than to provide valid arguments. I go further. Nevertheless, Leibniz defines the Theodicy as, I quote, a kind of near science in a letter to Debos. What legitimates such a definition? Kind of near science. And why does the Theodicy have this intermediate status? It is recognized as a discipline in its own right in the letter to Debos, but not as a science, strictly speaking. In my book, La question du mal chez Leibniz, fondement et élaboration de la Théodicée, I have tried to answer this question. I believe the different arguments we find in the Theodicy do not have the same value and the same weight because they do not have the same aim. If you want to understand the originality of the Leibnizian project, I think we have to read it as a diptych and draw a distinction between the refutative and defensive wing and the doctrinal wing. Leibniz's rhetorical strategy presupposes that different forms of discourses are used depending on whether the aim is to refute Bale's objections or to demonstrate positively the justice of God. Indeed, even, if it were possible, the existence of the best possible world. According to me, it is a mistake to confuse those two wings and not to see the precise function of the various proofs Leibniz puts forward in the one and in the other. The defensive wing, which is in particular developed in parts 2 and 3 of the Theodicy, when Leibniz examines closely Bale's objection, the defensive wing is composed of two sorts of defense. The one I have called negative or defensive in the strict sense, whose aim is just to reject the objection, to show its weakness. The other I have called positive or supererogatory, whose aim is to go further and show that some a posteriori arguments speak for divine providence. In this defensive wing, we find arguments founded on the ignorance of detail, conjectures, presumptions, and various degrees of probability. They do not have a real demonstrative value, but are sufficient if we consider their true aim, to reject objection. The doctrinal wing, which is in part developed in part 1, in particular developed in part 1 of the Theodicy, is divided into the two parts I have already mentioned. The theological one that deals with the conduct of God, and the anthropological one that deals with the freedom of man and his responsibility for evil. In this wing, Leibniz claims he puts forward a priori reason and true demonstrations. It is very important to keep in mind this diptych. That explains why Leibniz could give a different answer to the same question according to the defensive or the doctrinal perspective he adopts. For example, about the question of God's permission of evil, it is, I think, very interesting to compare what Leibniz says in the preliminary disputation, section 33, and what he says about the same question in the first part of Theodicy, section 24 and following. We must distinguish those two wings, but we must also regard them as integral parts of the Theodicy. It would be a mistake to consider the defense to be of secondary importance. It would amount to denying the relevance for Leibniz of non-absolute conclusive arguments, only founded on probability. It would amount to forgetting his interest in a logic that would allow us to estimate the weight of proofs based on probability and plausibility in a field where no demonstration is, strictly speaking, possible. This size of proof would be very useful when we have to make up our minds concerning facts, as in medicine, in politics, in jurisprudence, in ethics, and also in theology. We have to remember that evil is, first of all, a fact. Its explanation requires less an abstract theory of the best possible universe than an appropriate defense that proves objection against God's goodness are groundless or fallacious, and that there is more empirical evidence in favor of the divine perfection than against. So, defense and doctrine are complementary and even closely connected. Defense relies on the results of doctrine. It always presupposes it. On the other hand, doctrine is not sufficient without defense. It is vulnerable and laid upon to critics. The rules that must be applied in the defensive wing are described in the preliminary dissertation on the occasion of the discussion of the conformity of faith with reason. Section 57 to 79 contain a real art of disputation. I quote, "He who maintains a thesis, the respondent, is not bound to account for it, but he is bound to meet the objections of an opponent. A defendant in law is not bound, as a general rule, to prove his right or to produce his title to possession, but he is obliged to reply to the argument of the plaintiff. In fact, it is the duty of the opponent to demonstrate that the thesis is false. He has to give the decisive proofs that show that what the defendant argues is absurd." In the defensive wing of the Theodicy, Leibniz is like the defendant who maintains the thesis according to which God is good in spite of evil and has created the best possible world. Therefore, in that defensive wing, he is not obliged to account for his thesis. He only has to uphold it against objection. The aim here is just to repulse the attack of Baal, the opponent, that is, the negative defense, or to go further and defeat him on his own field, on the field of facts and appearances, in order to prove that, even there, the thesis is more plausible than its opposite, that is, what I have called the positive defense. I think Leibniz does not regard his theodicy as a science in its own right in the letter to Debos, because of the presence of non-demonstrative arguments in this defensive part. But there may be another reason. The point at issue is now to know if there are real demonstrations in the doctrinal part. Do we find something like a demonstration of God's justice, of his choosing the best, and of the existence of the best possible world? To answer this question, we have to clarify Leibniz's conception of demonstration. A demonstration is not like any other proof. Its requisites are very strict. A demonstration is a type of reasoning whose form and matter are absolutely correct. That means that all the premises it contains must be proved, that is to say, also demonstrated. Nothing may be supposed that would not be demonstrated. A demonstration consists in showing by analysis the inherence of the predicate in the subject. Only truth, as you know, truth of reason can be, strictly speaking, demonstrated as their analyses are performed in a finite time. They are necessary so that the opposite implies contradiction.